welcome back to Otaku no Video. As always, thank you very much for joining me for the second part of my primer on visual novels. And in this part, I'm going to be talking about and going through a history of visual novels. Now, one issue, as you'll see at the end, is that I don't have much information on the visual novels that have been big in the past 5 or 10 years, or at least have been really influential. So it's going to peter off a little bit at the end. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of this primer, visual novels in the early days, 80s basically, were just long pornographic sequences. They were just images of people having sex on screen, and you sort of page through it, and there'd be text at the bottom telling you what people are saying. And those games eventually introduced a little interactivity, but it was just a set of sex scenes, mostly rape, frankly. You wake up in the morning, you go outside, there's a girl there, you rape her. Then you go to school, you grab a girl in the hallway, you rape. It's basically that. So the problem facing these porn game makers was that graphics at the time kind of looked like this. It's really hard to render a pretty woman, especially a realistic woman, using graphics of this caliber. However, you could represent and use anime art, and anime art would render fairly well using these very simple graphics. So visual novels ended up using this art style, and so porn on PC games, at least, and of course, in general, digitally, ended up using anime art kind of by default, and that just became just the way you did things. It's one of the reasons why PC games have had anime-style porn for so long, because that was just the easiest way of representing, naked girls, frankly, without just looking horrible. Granted, this doesn't look great either, but it's better than the alternative. So these games were just extended sex scenes, basically. Then along came a company called Elf, and they wanted to make a game that would rise a bit above and just be different. Not be just another game with sex. What can we do to be different? And so they said, well, what if the sex came at the end of a sequence of dating the girl? What if you didn't just immediately get sex, but you had to actually date the girl first? So they released Dokusei in 1992, and this is the first basic dating sim. You actually had to spend time with a girl before she'd put out, frankly. And so this was quite popular and introduced this idea that you could actually have dating in a game, and it wasn't just all about sex. And this was popular enough and influential enough that others followed suit. And then Konami in 1994 released Tokimeki Memorial. Very popular game. Ended up becoming one of those things that was popular in the anime and manga community and so forth, beyond the visual novel world. And this is the first full dating sim. You actually date girls all the way through high school. This is a long-form game, and you're actually forming full-scale relationships with these girls over time, which I think is a really neat idea, and I wish that would kind of come back. And Tokimeki Memorial was just hugely popular. It really, really worked. Now, this marked the point at which visual novels started turning more into dating sims. It was, you go out on dates with girls and eventually have sex, basically. Meanwhile, there's another company called Leaf, and they were having a lot of problems. Their games were not selling at all. And so they decided they would make 3 different visual novels that were all experimental, and hopefully one of them would sell. And their first one was Shizuku. It released in 1996, and this was the first game with voice acting. Now, back in '96, hard drives were still very small, 20, 40 megs, something along those lines. And the discs were half a meg, roughly. And games were already coming out on 5, 8, 10 discs. So the problem was, if you tried to install that on your hard drive, that would take up a large chunk of your hard drive. You couldn't just install a bunch of different games. So when they decided to introduce voice acting, that meant a lot of discs, and it meant that the player had to commit to using that hard drive space for that. And there's just no way of playing a game with voice acting on floppy disk. You have to swap discs constantly. So anyway, they gambled on it, and they actually introduced voice acting in this, and it took off. Shizuku was, not a massive success, but definitely a really solid hit. and definitely made its money and was a good thing for the company. So their next game, Kizuato, they were able to release that, and that was a murder mystery. Now there had been plenty of like horror themed and sort of more Guro style visual novels beforehand, but Kizuato actually had a full-scale murder mystery plotline that you're sort of following throughout the story. So it's not just, oh my gosh, terrible things are happening. You're trying to figure it out, and there's clues scattered throughout the whole thing, and so forth. And as you can see, very polished artwork. Then, for their third experiment, and Kizuato did fine, for their third experiment, Leaf decided to go in a different direction. They'd make a heartwarming high school romance called To Heart. This was hugely popular. I mean, to the point that one of the tracks from To Heart was put on karaoke machines in Japan. To give you a feel, that would be like the theme for a porn movie playing on the radio over here. It's just inconceivable. And To Heart was just that popular. And it marks the point at which visual novels were now starting to become big enough and popular enough that it was catching the attention of, if not the mainstream, then it wasn't just a tiny little niche. This was now a part of at least otaku society, if not overall society, and so forth. To Heart would go on to spawn anime series, manga doujinshi, all sorts of stuff. It was a full-scale franchise very, very quickly. So that was a really big thing. Over at Tactics, the developers decided to take that idea of sort of the heartwarming story and really break it down and refine it. And they released one to the Radiant Season in 1998, and they came up with what they call the crying game formula, which basically states that the game begins with lighthearted comedy for the first third, roughly, followed by heartwarming romance for the next third or so, with some heart-wrenching twist about the characters. That was then followed by tragic separation and a heartwarming and emotional reunion. Now, actually, in the game, it's actually more like this. You know, it's mostly comedy and romance, and then that sort of finale at the end. So the core developers from that actually broke off and formed their own company called Key, and their first release was a game called Canon. Canon is kind of the Star Wars of visual novels. Not only was it ridiculously popular, Canon has become, you know, something that otaku in Japan consider. You kind of have to play Canon to be an anime or to be an otaku. It is one of those core texts of otakudom, at least in Japan. And in Canon now, sex was a minor footnote to the story. In fact, most of the releases of Canon are all ages. It is just, it is big, it is popular, and it was just, again, it's one of these core things for otaku in Japan, and released in June 1999. Now, there have been a few other interesting games since Canon. Tsukihime, developed by Type Moon, came out in December 2000. This is completely fan-produced. Now, granted, most visual novel companies are small, 5, 10 people, something thereabouts. So we're not talking huge companies in general, but Tsukihime was developed completely by fans. Not only was it a very popular game, it also spawned other games, and it spawned 2 full-scale anime series, professional anime series off of that. So that's a pretty big deal that fans could come together and make a quality product like that. And then in 2002, we saw Higurashi When They Cry, developed by the same folks. I'm sorry, different folks, typo there. But Higurashi is not only fan-produced, it is also a horror series. And I'm talking full-scale horror. In fact, they came up with what they call the Crying in Fear game formula, starting with lighthearted comedy and then a heartwarming story with a horrific twist, and then horror and death, because people getting chopped to pieces with axes. In a typical visual novel, there are good endings and bad endings. Good ending, you end up with a girl. Bad ending, you don't. In this, the bad ending means you get your eyes gouged out by one of the girls. It's bad. Also, Higurashi is remarkable for the fact that there are multiple games in the series, and those are all planned. There's a larger story. Each released game in the Higurashi series tells part of this larger story. So it's not just we have this one game idea and then each time we come up with new stuff. It is sort of this larger plot line, which is new and interesting. And that's where we come up to in terms of what we know about the last decade or so of visual novels. It just hasn't there just hasn't really been much information about the novels that have been really influential in the past 5 or 10 years, which granted is common in any sort of medium like this, that what has been really massively influential in movies in the past 5 years. Kind of hard to say. So that's my primer on visual novels. I'm still learning. As I develop more, I will be updating this as I can. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for joining me. That's it.